You know that moment. The one where intention stands tall inside you, bright and sharp, as certain as a promise, and yet your brain refuses to move. You make a plan with the clarity of sunrise, you feel the conviction in your chest, and you can see the end of the task as if it were already finished. And then, as if some gentle conspiracy of small, invisible forces has gathered around you, the plan dissolves. Minutes slide into hours, hours into days. That certainty becomes an ache, and the ache becomes a story you tell yourself about who you are. Unreliable, dithering, one step behind the life you intended to live. What if I told you this is not primarily a failure of willpower? What if I told you that the gap between intention and action is more like a canyon shaped by ancient, sensible, and sometimes contradictory machinery, biological, psychological, and existential, operating beneath your awareness? And that if you learn to see the canyon not as a moral indictment but as a landscape with features to study, you can cross it more often than you think. Imagine your mind as two rooms with a door between them. In the first room you plan, you dream, rehearse outcomes, write lists, make pledges to future you. The second room is where you act. It is noisy and concrete and impatient. The door between these rooms is often narrow and low, clogged with small things: uncertainty, fear, habit, the soft gravity of comfort. Intention lives in the well-lit room of what could be. Action lives in the dim, stubborn room of what must be done. The trouble begins when you think deciding is the same as doing. They are neighboring acts, but different muscles, different atmospheres. Why does action feel harder than intention? Because intention, at its best, is an imagination exercise. Action confronts the world's roughness. Intention is fueled by future rewards. The imagined applause, the relief, the sense of completion. Action trades in the present moment, where costs are immediate and rewards are delayed. The mind evolved to prefer immediate relief over deferred reward. It tells you, in 1,000 clever ways, that the small pleasure now is worth more than the larger prize later. This makes sense if your ancestors faced scarcity and danger. It makes less sense when your modern life asks you to value a future that is abstract, vague, and lumped together with thousands of other futures. So you postpone, and postponing brings a small, temporary balm, a relief of anxiety, a few minutes of distraction, a quieting of the inner critic. That relief is the currency of procrastination. But there is more. Behind the procrastination lies a conversation you rarely notice. It is not only the conversation between plan and execution. It is also the conversation between your sense of who you are and the risk that acting might change that sense. If you start the task and fail, what does that say about you? If you begin and succeed, who will you be then, capable, visible, expected to continue? For many of us, standing at the threshold of action is standing at the edge of identity change, and identity is sticky. To try is to risk losing old excuses. To succeed is to admit that the story you told yourself about your limits was wrong. Paradoxically, staying still preserves identity. It is safer. Perfectionism lives nearby, whispering the rules. Do it perfectly or not at all. Analysis paralysis sets the scene. If I could only figure out the perfect method, I would begin. The mind fabricates 1,000 technicalities to explain why action must wait. Silence, waiting, the search for ideal conditions. These are the comfortable infinity loops that feel like prudence but are actually avoidance. The mind that preps endlessly believes it is being wise. In truth, it is sheltering itself from a risk that is mostly imaginary. There is also a softer, quieter mechanism at work: emotion regulation. We often think we procrastinate because of time mismanagement, but more often than not we delay because a task triggers anxiety, boredom, shame, or low mood, and avoiding the task repairs those feelings in the short run. You choose the smaller emotional discomfort, a few minutes of guilt, over the intense, immediate emotion, fear of failure, shame, dread. So the immediate mood matters more than the long-term plan. You are not being lazy. You are being humanly rational in the short-term calculus of feeling better now. What do we do with this knowledge? How do we reclaim momentum from the soft gravity that keeps us anchored to our couches and to-do lists? A philosophical answer and a practical one can walk together. Philosophically, think of action as a small commitment to the shape of your life. Each time you choose movement over stasis, you signal to yourself who you are becoming. Action is an identity-forming agent. So one way to cross the canyon is to shrink the size of what counts as evidence. Instead of demanding the whole mountain be moved, ask only for a pebble. Tell yourself not that you will finish the book today, but that you will open the document and write one sentence. The paradox here becomes your ally. One sentence is almost always doable. Once the page is warm, the body and mind often follow. Smallness is not triviality. It is strategy. Psychologically, design the doorway. If intention lives in a bright future and action in the present, create a bridge that carries the future into the present. Make specific plans that link a cue to an action. If this happens, I will do that. This is not hand-holding. It is the architecture of behavior. Promise yourself implementation. When the clock hits 9, I will sit down for 15 minutes. Put friction in the path of avoidance. Remove the temptations that seduce you away, and add friction to the path of your old habits. Change the environment so the first step is obvious and easy. Yet strategy alone is not enough. You must befriend the emotions that used to drive your avoidance. Radical self-compassion becomes a technology of action. When you notice the familiar worry, "What if I'm not good enough?" Treat it as an old companion who is frightened, not as an enemy who must be shamed. Say to the fear, "I see you." You do not have to agree with everything you feel. This stance of curious kindness does something surprising. It lowers the stakes. When you stop escalating your own anxiety, the energy that went into avoidance becomes available for doing. Another gentle method is ritualization. A ritual is a small performance designed to mark the crossing from planning to doing. The act can be as simple as making a cup of tea, lighting a candle, or tying your shoelaces in a particular way. Ritual reduces the intimidation of beginnings by creating a predictable pattern. Cue, ritual, work. The ritual functions like a handshake with the part of you that resists change. It says, "We have a way to move together." Once the pattern is established, the ritual itself becomes a cue that the first step is possible. Consider also public and social commitments. When you tell one person about your intention, you convert a private desire into a social contract. We humans are delightfully social animals. We care about how others see us. Use that as a resource. But be careful. Public commitments can become another form of pressure if they are too grand or too vague. Make them specific and small enough to be achievable, so the social force invites action rather than fosters shame. Finally, let curiosity be your currency. Replace an internal monologue of reproach with questions that open rather than close. What would happen if I began for 5 minutes? What small experiment could I run to test this fear? What is the smallest version of this project that still matters? Curiosity reduces the drama of trying by turning it into inquiry. The posture of experiment, not trial by fire, invites you to try without putting your identity on the line. Listen. The canyon is real, but it is crossable. You are not defective for finding the first step hard. You are human, wired to protect yourself against uncertainty. The work is to become ingenious at moving past your protections, designing scaffolds that honor your emotions while guiding your body toward action. Begin with the tiniest of promises. Keep your instruments simple. A cue, a plan, a ritual, a compassionate voice. Build identity slowly by repeating small deeds and by telling a different story about who you are. Not someone who waits until the moon is full, but someone who begins. Let that narrative, accumulated day by day, pull the future you imagine into the room you occupy right now. Ask yourself, what is the cost of waiting another month? What will it feel like to have acted, even imperfectly? If you could reframe procrastination as a signal instead of a sentence, what would it be pointing to? Fear, boredom, confusion, perfectionism? If you could move toward that signal with curiosity, what small experiment would you run tomorrow morning? There is tenderness in this problem. Underneath the frustration and the self-reproach is a creature who wants to be spared suffering and to be known. Begin there. Begin with curiosity and smallness, with rituals and compassion. Begin by moving once, even for 5 minutes. The rest of the work, Persistence, refinement, meaning will grow from that single motion. There are rooms inside you where conversations happen that you never invited and yet somehow always attend. Part of you sits at a little round table, speech ready and eyes bright. Another part leans back in a shadowed corner, crossing its arms like a veteran at the end of a long watch. There is a voice that briefs, a voice that fears, a voice that postpones, and a voice that sings. The part we promise to meet in this chapter is not a single thing called you, and it is not a simple failure to obey a plan. It is a committee of voices, each with its own history, its own logic, and its own tender, sometimes tyrannical reasons for speaking up when action should happen. One voice is the critic. It wears armor made from old disappointments and parental cautions. It remembers every misstep and has a memory like a ledger. The critic rarely says, "Try." It says, "Don't embarrass us. Don't risk exposure." Its language is blunt and protective because protection felt necessary once. The critic is not evil. When there was real danger or real ridicule, its vigilance saved you. But now it is often outdated hardware running on an old operating system. It protects you by keeping you small. Another voice is the planner. The planner is bright, optimistic, and secretly proud. It loves lists, projections, and contingency maps. It rehearses futures, how the day will go, what the presentation will contain, how the conversation will end. The planner is a masterpiece of imagination, but it is happiest in the realm of possibility. For the planner, thinking is doing. It can become deeply committed to preparations and indefinitely committed to revision. The planner is not the enemy of action. It is the enemy of clumsy beginnings. Then there is the saboteur, who often looks like a friend. A small, delighted whisper that chooses now for comfort. The saboteur offers immediate remedies. One more scroll, one more snack, one more, "I'll start tomorrow." It is a master of plausibility. To the saboteur, the future is abstract. The present offers a known warmth. Its calculus is simple. Short-term relief now is preferable to long-term gain later. That calculus, once useful, now conspires with modern temptations. There is the perfectionist, a cousin of the critic, who equates worth with the flawless. It will not submit anything less than an immaculate proof of your value. And there is the caretaker, who calculates the cost of your action in emotional currency. If you do this, someone will be disappointed. If you push, what will that mean for the comfort of those who depend on you? Kindness softens into stasis when care takes the shape of avoidance. Finally, there is the muse, the nervous, luminous voice that appears at dawn and around midnight. The muse does not like deadlines. It likes conditions, mystical conditions. It will not be hurried. The muse is the place of creative hunger and also of fragile timing. When ignored or scolded, the muse withdraws and sulks, joining the chorus that says, "Wait, not now." These voices are not isolated actors, but a chorus. They form patterns, alliances, and rivalries. The critic and perfectionist often whisper in unison. The saboteur and caretaker swap strategies. The planner is sometimes their hostage, chaining itself to an ever-perfect schedule. The muse keeps a small lamp under the table and peers out when the others argue. To turn this chaotic multi-voice inside you into something useful, you must learn to hold a council. This is not a battle to be won by silencing voices. It is a negotiation. Imagine a warm room with chairs for each voice. Call them by names that feel true: the watcher, the engineer, the small friend, the judge, the artist. Naming is not trivial. It removes the anonymity that fuels guilt and gives each voice a face and habit. Once named, voices can be heard and spoken to. Ask them, "What are you trying to protect me from? What do you fear will happen if I begin? What do you want instead?" These are not rhetorical devices. If you listen, each voice will answer, often with surprising wisdom. The critic will typically answer with scarcity and shame. It will say that failure would be proof of unworthiness. Answer it by acknowledging the care inside the criticism. Speak back gently. "I know you want to keep me safe. I hear that failing would hurt. I will not seek humiliation, but I will accept learning." The planner, when asked, will often provide useful structure. Ask it for the smallest possible plan, 5 minutes, 1 paragraph, 1 dish. The saboteur will confess to craving reprieve. Offer it a trade. A brief, genuine break after the work sprint, not a surrender to distraction disguised as rest. The perfectionist will describe intolerable discomfort at flawed outputs. Soothe it with permission to produce drafts and to revise. The caretaker will tell you who it is trying to keep from harm. Validate that intention and show how small action can actually increase safety in the long run. The muse will yield to invitation more than command. Invite the muse with a small ritual that signals safety and containment. Come sing for 15 minutes while I promise not to judge. There are practical ways to hold this counsel that make the negotiation more real. Sit in different chairs and speak from each perspective. Let the critic speak its case, then reply from the seat of the planner. Write dialogues where each voice gets a paragraph. Use separate pages, colors, or fonts to make them distinct. This externalization, moving the voices from inside to outside, reduces the tyranny of blended emotion and gives you manageable objects to work with. It also helps you discover hidden motivations. Often the critic is not merely cruel but exhausted. The saboteur is not malevolent but lonely. When voices fight for your decision, try an experiment in compromise. Promise the critic that you will set a limit and evaluate honestly afterward. Promise the saboteur a real treat after a defined work block. Promise the perfectionist that there will be a careful revision phase, distinct from the messy first draft. These simple promises reorganize incentives inside you. You are not tricking yourself. You are rearranging your internal economy so that action has fewer costs and the rewards are immediate enough to matter. Philosophically, this counsel work is an act of authorship. To live skillfully is to accept that you are not a monolith but an assemblage, an anthology of voices that each has contributed to who you are. If you treat them as unchangeable commands, you live in what philosophers call bad faith, acting as if you had no authorship over your choices. If you take responsibility for convening the council, for listening, and then for deciding with a wide-angle lens, you reclaim agency. The author of your life is not the loudest voice, but the one who can hold the room and make room for negotiation. There is also a psychological truth here. Action changes the balance of voices. When you act, however imperfectly, the internal ledger updates. The critic loses a little authority because the record now contains evidence that you do not always fail. The planner gains credibility because a plan translated into a tiny execution. The saboteur is placated, offered a controlled pleasure as a reward, and slowly learns that deferral is not the only relief. The muse, if invited rather than boycotted, returns more often. Small acts are not mere steps toward tasks. They are recalibrations of your inner committee. Technology for this recalibration can be simple and immediate. Name the voice, reason with it, trade with it, and then act in the smallest possible way that still counts. If the critic demands certainty, acknowledge uncertainty and commit to a 15-minute test. If the perfectionist demands impeccability, offer it an explicit draft phase with a guarantee of later refinement. If the saboteur asks for rest, schedule a real rest after a genuine small push. If the muse demands the right conditions, create a tiny ritual that promises the muse a constrained playground. You may have 30 minutes of uninterrupted exploration after I write 3 paragraphs. These promises are contracts within you. Keep them or renegotiate honestly. Sometimes the council will reveal deeper histories, how certain voices are heirs of childhood rules, how some habits have a family accent, how shame arrived with the first teacher's frown. Recognize the origin story without surrendering to it. The past shaped these voices. It does not have to sentence them. Compassion is the tool that dissolves the old imperative of harshness. When you meet the critic with curiosity rather than combat, you discover that softness does not mean permissiveness. It means clarity. A softer voice does not have to be weaker. It can be the voice that says, "I will keep trying," tenderly, relentlessly, with small tests. Ask yourself right now, which voice is loudest? What would happen if you asked that voice to sit down for 5 minutes while you did a different thing? What would you need to say to the critic to show it that you are not careless but prepared to learn? What would you need to promise the saboteur to turn its offer of escape into a partnerable reward? There will be resistance. The voices are used to old patterns. Changing them requires repetition, small evidence, and a patient hand. But each little negotiation is a lesson in governance. Over time, the council learns to collaborate. The planner becomes an efficient ally, the critic a cautious editor, the saboteur a source of needed breaks. The muse learns that constraints can amplify inspiration. You become, through practice, the one who both listens and decides. If you want, tonight try a simple exercise. Imagine the council, pick the two voices that argue most often about your work, and write a 4-line exchange between them. Let each voice name its fear and its desire. Then, from a third seat, the seat of the present chooser, speak a 1-line compromise. That single line, once lived, will shift the room. We are always a chorus. Learning to lead it is not about winning a war. It is about learning language for the private politics of intention and action. When the voices sit at the table and feel heard, they are less likely to sabotage and more likely to support the small courageous moves that, stitched together, become habit, competence, and a story you can sleep with at night. In the next part, we will trace how habits form that convert tiny acts into durable identity, and how to build that architecture so your council's agreements become real. When you are ready, we'll go on. There is a secret architecture beneath every life, an array of small, repeated actions so subtle that they feel accidental, and yet over months and years they carve a canyon of identity. Habits are not merely things you do. They are the scaffolding of who you become. Think of them as the riverbeds your days pour into. At first, the trickle is insignificant, almost invisible, but with enough patience, the water shapes stone. This is why beginning is so important, and why beginning small is often the bravest strategy. Small flows, faithfully kept, quarry huge changes. When you watch someone who seems effortlessly steady, don't be fooled. What looks like effortless is usually the result of an invisible discipline. A chain of small, often boring acts performed long enough that the body and mind stop needing persuasion. The brain, which is astonishingly efficient about saving energy, learns to automate repeated behavior. It budgets less intention for what it has practiced. Where a novice must think through every step, a habit holder walks from impulse to action with a kind of quiet economy. This economy is neither moral nor magical. It is biochemical and social. The neural pathways that fires together wire together, and repetition is the currency of wiring. But repetition alone is blunt. Habits are not created simply by doing something once and waiting. They form within a loop, a cue, a routine, and a reward. The cue is the whisper that says, now. It might be a time of day, a place, a feeling, or another action. The routine is the behavior you perform. The reward is confirmation, sensory, emotional, social, that the action mattered. The mind is hooked to repeat anything that reliably produces a reward. In the modern world, the danger is that cheap, immediate rewards are everywhere. A little screen, a sugar spike, the comfort of unconsciousness. These low-cost payoffs can drown out the slow, subtle rewards that come from work that grows over time. So how do you grow habits that favor the person you mean to be? Start where the architecture begins, at the cue. Make beginnings obvious. If you want to write each morning, set your notebook where you will see it the moment you wake. If you want to run, lay out your shoes by the bed. The mind loves signals. Design yours so the signal to act is stronger than the signal to avoid. You are not tricking yourself, you are being strategic about the way your attention is allocated. Intention is fragile. Environment is stubborn. Tilt the environment toward the action you want. Shrink the work into something microscopic. The 2-minute rule is not a joke. Reduce the initiation to 2 minutes. Want to meditate? Sit and breathe for 2 minutes. Want to write? Open the file and write 1 sentence. Want to exercise? Do 2 minutes of movement. The point is not to be satisfied with tininess forever. It is to make the first motion inevitable. Momentum is an economy with dramatically diminishing friction. Once you have acted for 2 minutes, it is easier to act for 20. The trick is to protect the very beginning because beginnings cost the most. Anchor new actions to old ones. Habit stacking is a gift the mind gives you when you respect existing grooves. After the cue of an existing habit, append the new one. After I make coffee, I will read 1 page. After I brush my teeth, I will write one line. The old habit acts as a reliable cue. The new habit borrows credibility. This is not a subtle maneuver, this is architectural borrowing. It lets you plant a seed where conditions are already fertile. Build in rewards that are immediate and meaningful. The brain cares deeply about timing. A reward a week from now is often indistinguishable from nothing. So scaffold long-term purpose with short-term pleasures. Celebrate small wins. Put a check mark on a calendar. Allow yourself a tiny treat only if you complete the act. Pair a difficult behavior with a pleasurable one, temptation bundling, so the habit pays its own currency now rather than only in the distant future. The secret is not indulgence. It is legitimate, immediate reinforcement. Design friction for the things you want less of. Want to reduce doom scrolling? Put your phone in another room or put an app behind a password. Want to eat fewer sweets? Store them out of sight or off the counter. Removing convenience from unwanted behaviors is as powerful as adding convenience to desired ones. You are an engineer of possibility. Change the wiring and the circuits will follow. Consider identity, not outcomes. The most durable habits are not about ticking off accomplishments. They are about becoming the kind of person who does certain things. The voice that says, "I am not a morning person," is not merely descriptive. It is prescriptive. It tells the mind what to look for and which actions make sense. Flip that script. Instead of saying, "I want to write" or "I will run," say, "I am a person who writes," or "I am the kind of person who makes time for movement." This is not self-deception if you make it actionable. It is a practical psychology. What small action, repeated daily, would make that identity claim true? Ask that and then make the action simple enough to be obedient to. Yet even the most clever architecture can falter if we ignore the emotional cost of change. Habits are coalitions between behavior and feeling. If starting a new habit makes you feel ashamed, exposed, or exhausted, the counsel inside you will resist. This is where compassion enters as a structural plank. Instead of framing failure as proof of deficiency, frame it as information. What broke the chain? Was the cue absent? Was the reward too weak? Did you expect too much from day one? Troubleshoot kindly. Recalibrate. Keep the promise small enough to feel possible. The tender mind is not the weak mind. It is the durable one. Think about keystone habits, small acts that cascade into other changes. Sleep, movement, and basic nutrition are often keystones because they stabilize mood, energy, and decision capacity. Improve one keystone and you get leverage. Better sleep reduces willpower depletion, making it easier to enact a plan later in the day. Choose leverage. Choose habits that amplify. Accountability is not merely social pressure. It is a signal that connects private action to public narrative. Tell one person about your tiny habit. Set a check-in. Use technology to track and show your progress. Visualize streaks. "Don't break the chain" is not an empty slogan. Visible evidence of continuity becomes a psychological reward in its own right. We humans hate incoherence. We like to keep promises we make, even to ourselves. A calendar full of excess becomes a small shrine to self-trust. Permit relapse as part of the process. You will miss days. The wise rule is not perfection but resilience. Never miss twice. If you skip today, plan the next day and keep going. The rhythm that matters is return, not linearity. Each return rewires the brain more strongly than the absence does. The story you tell about the lapse. Does it create guilt that sticks or curiosity that learns? Make it curiosity. There is an artistry to scaling habits. Once a tiny pattern is stable, you can expand it horizontally or deepen it vertically. Horizontal widening adds related practices. If you now read one page with your morning coffee, add one paragraph of reflection. Vertical deepening increases the intensity. If you do 2 minutes of movement, nudge it to 5 and then to 15. But expansion must never forget the core law. Do not sacrifice reliability for quantity. It is better to habitually do 2 minutes than to sporadically do an hour. Philosophically, habits are the grammar of character. They translate abstract ideals into daily practice. If you admire courage, what small action each day would translate admiration into competence? If you value attention, what tiny discipline will teach your nervous system to resist distraction? Ask these questions not as moral imperatives but as invitations. Which small acts align your present behavior with the person you want to be 5 years from now? Finally, remember that habits are social and narrative. We are not islands. The people around you and the stories you tell are part of the habitat. Choose companions and texts that echo the rhythms you want. Tell yourself a story that includes the good and the hard parts, the false starts, the repairs, the tiny triumphs. The story stitches your actions into meaning. Meaning extends motivation beyond the calculus of immediate reward. Now, right now, ask yourself, what is the 1-2-minute habit that would signal the identity you want? What obvious cue can you place in your environment tonight to make that 2 minutes inevitable tomorrow morning? What reward will you give yourself that the brain will remember? Make that tiny plan like a wire that spans a canyon. Short, taut, and meant only to be stepped on once. Take that step. The water will begin to flow. When you are ready, we will trace how to keep that stream from evaporating, how to scale, to repair, and to make habits not only sustainable but generative of a life that feels like yours. There is a quiet ledger inside you that keeps account of two things: what you want to do and what your body, mood, and history allow you to do right now. We call that ledger many names: willpower, self-control, grit. But whatever you call it, it feels like a resource that can be spent, saved, or squandered. You wake with good intentions, and by noon you are taxed. A kind of invisible tax has been levied on your capacity to act. That experience is not moral failure. It is the honest arithmetic of energy. Action asks for energy in 3 currencies: physical, cognitive, and emotional. The muscles of your body need fuel. The thinking mind needs rest from noise and choice. The heart needs a sense of meaning, safety, or manageable discomfort to move. When any one of those accounts is overdrawn, action becomes harder and procrastination seems, perversely, like wisdom. Why expend more when the account screams insufficient funds? Understanding the contours of that energetic economy is not an excuse for inertia. It is an invitation to manage your life like a steward of a fragile, wondrous system. Think of willpower not as a single muscle but as a network of systems that can be supported, protected, and replenished. Early in the day, after sleep and a gentle ritual of waking, your cognitive account is richer. Later in the afternoon, after decisions and emotional labor, your reserves are lower. The surface-level advice, "do the hard thing first," isn't a universal law. It is a tactical suggestion rooted in this rhythm. But tactics must be personalized. Some people find their clarity at dawn, others in the small, luminous hours before night. The practical question is, where does your nervous system do its best work, and how can you align your tasks to that truth? There is also a deeper truth about motivation. It is not one thing but many. Sometimes motivation rushes in like a tide: joy, inspiration, curiosity, and the work feels easy. Other times motivation must be summoned like a stubborn guest, dragged from the street and coaxed by food and warmth. The first kind comes from internal alignment. The task matches a deep interest or a felt identity. The second kind comes from architecture: pre-commitments, social contracts, visible streaks, tiny rituals that make the first motion irresistible. Both are valid. One is bright and intrinsic. The other is engineered but honest. One of the most humane ways to tend your willpower is to reduce the number of decisions you must make about the trivial. Decision fatigue is real in the everyday sense. Every little choice consumes a sliver of attention, and the accumulation leaves you vulnerable. If you want a practical lab in which to test this, try a day of limiting small choices. Wear the same outfit for a week, batch your emails, choose 3 priorities, and refuse all new toy tasks. Notice how your mental horizon clears when the petty errands of choice are minimized. You are not being rigid, you are preserving your attention for what matters. Another soft technique is to honor cycles of work and rest. The human brain is not built for constant focus. We naturally pulse between high concentration states and softer, diffuse attention. Learn your ultradian rhythm, your cycles of attention, and build them into your schedule. Work in honest sprints, then close the door on the task and rest with intention. The rest is not laziness. It is a strategic refill. Small, frequent recoveries preserve stamina better than heroic marathons followed by collapse. Compassion is also a form of energy management. When you berate yourself for running out of steam, you expend more of the scarce thing you need, emotional energy. Guilt multiplies resistance. Instead, practice a different stance. Notice the depletion, name it aloud. I'm tired. This is hard right now. And treat the tiredness as a signal to change tactics, not to punish character. This is not indulgence. It is triage. When your system is acknowledged and cared for, you can return to the work with more integrity. Motivation also thrives on meaning. The same task can feel like punishment or pilgrimage depending on the story you tell about it. Find the thread of meaning that connects the mundane action to something larger, to the person you want to become, to the relationship you are nourishing, to the question you are exploring. If the meaning feels thin, cultivate curiosity instead. Turn the task into an experiment, a question to be answered rather than a verdict to be passed. Curiosity lightens the load of expectation and converts anxiety into investigation, which is often less threatening. There is a political economy inside you as well. How much of your life is spent complying with external demands and how much with internal commitments? People who live largely at the behest of others spend energy on impression management, on translation, on constant small calibrations. That energy is real and finite. Carve out spaces where you do not have to be on stage. Protect them like sacred rooms. These are the moments when intrinsic motivation can be found and tended. They function like retreats that replenish a soldier's courage. Sometimes the solution to exhaustion is structural and public. Pre-commitment devices. Lock the house, commit money, appoint an accountability partner. When you move the cost of not doing into the social or financial realm, you change the incentives in a concrete way. Pre-commitment is not trickery. It is a pact with your future self. It acknowledges honestly that you will not be the same person in every moment and honors that by creating scaffolding that makes the desired path the easier path. There is also an important moral imagination at play. We valorize heroism, the person who wills and does despite fatigue. Heroism has its place. Sometimes you must act though the lamp is low. But heroism cannot be the daily operating principle. If you run your life like a single, continuous act of heroism, you will burn. Design your life so that heroics are occasional and rest is routine. Ask yourself, which heroic moments are necessary and which can be avoided by better organization, better boundaries, or clearer priorities. And then there is the quiet sabotage of identity theft, the stories that tell you who you are and therefore what you can do. If you say, I am not disciplined, you will audition behaviors that confirm that script. If you say, I am someone who cares enough to try, you will create room for small repetitions. Rehearse the more helpful script with tiny, consistent acts. Identity is not forged in grand declarations, but in the plumbing of everyday choices. Each time you show up for 5 honest minutes, you deposit credibility into your bank of selfhood. Curiosity questions. What would you do differently if you believed your energy was something to manage, not to judge? Which small, non-negotiable rituals would you build to protect your capacity? The ones that feel so sacred you would not skip them. What boundary could you draw this week that would preserve cognitive bandwidth for the one project that most matters? Finally, remember that motivation often follows action. Waiting for motivation is a temptation. Movement creates its own fuel. The body remembers what the mind forgets. Muscles that have been used are more willing to be used again. The trick is to use movement to buy movement, 2 minutes, a paragraph, 1 step, and then let the tiny motion recruit the rest. This is not a formulaic promise. It is a habit of trust. You will trust that your system often wakes with a single, small touch. If you can steward your energy by aligning tasks to your rhythms, by limiting trivial decisions, by practicing rest with intention, by making meaning visible, and by creating small, enforceable pacts, you reduce the everyday taxation on willpower and increase the frequency with which intention becomes action. Treat your mind like the delicate instrument it is. Tune it with rituals, protect it from unnecessary noise, and feed it with purpose that is as concrete as your morning cup. There is a quiet law about human beings that we rarely state plainly. We were built to move in relation to one another. Our intentions are not private atoms floating in a vacuum. They are signals thrown into a social field where other minds receive, reflect, bend, amplify, or blunt them. To understand why action feels harder than intention, you have to look not only at the private machinery of desire and dread, but at the social architecture that either supports motion or turns it into a public spectacle of risk. We are social animals. The people around us, the norms that hum beneath conversation, and the rituals we inherit press on our hearts every hour. Sometimes they lift us like scaffolding. Sometimes they tighten like a noose. Think about a room where work is being done. Hands move, eyes concentrate, laptops hum. There is a kind of contagion in that room. Presence begets presence. Small, visible acts reduce the threshold to act. That is why co-working, study halls, and writing groups are not just cute modern inventions. They are ancient technologies, social bridges that translate private intention into public, doable motion. When someone nearby makes the first choice, opens a notebook, sits down, your own body learns by proximity that beginning is allowed. Social proximity is not merely encouragement. It is a structural lowering of the starting barrier. But social influence is double-edged. The same gaze that can scaffold can also shame. Publicness is powerful because it changes the stakes of failure and success. A promise kept publicly becomes a currency of trust. A promise broken publicly accrues moral weight. That is why public commitment is such a common tool. Making an intention visible converts private friction into social pressure. Yet if the environment is punitive, if mistakes are met with ridicule rather than repair, publicness becomes a deterrent. The same crowd that can cheer you on can also freeze you with fear. The task, then, is to invite social force but to curate its form. Choose witnesses who will hold you with kindness and consequence, not spectators who will magnify your worst anxieties. Culture is the invisible scaffold that gives our actions shape. Some cultures prize hustle, speed, measurable outputs. Others value care, deliberation, and relational continuity. These cultural logics seep into our bones. If the dominant narrative around you is that worth equals productivity, every delay becomes a moral failure. If your circle values experimentation and repair, lapses are data points, not indictments. You cannot entirely escape culture, but you can choose which cultural fields you spend time in. The people you inhabit, the books you read, the feeds you follow. Each is a microclimate that either favors movement or fosters paralysis. Choosing your social climate is as practical as choosing your diet. There is another feature of social life that is both cruel and kind: comparison. We instinctively measure ourselves against neighbors and against curated portrayals of success. Comparison can motivate if it demonstrates a plausible next step, someone slightly ahead on the path who models the doable. But it can also annihilate. A constant stream of distant peaks can make your own slope feel impossible. The remedy is not isolation but selective proximity. Seek models who are similar enough to make the steps believable, and limit exposure to the highlight reels that crush instead of guide. If every feed is a parade of polished monuments, the simple act of beginning will look grotesquely inadequate. Reframe comparison as information. What is the next concrete practice to borrow, not the gulf to measure yourself against? Communities of practice hold special power because they combine belonging with apprenticeship. When you join a small group where the ritual is to show work in progress and to critique kindly, you buy into a learning loop that rewards doing. The group does not judge identity. It judges work and improvement. This orientation transforms anxiety into curiosity. Where can you find such a community? Look for places, online or local, where people meet regularly to do the thing you want to do, where the culture prizes regular, small acts over occasional heroics. The magic is not in grand declarations. It is in the repeated public attempt. Notice how obligation to a small group feels more exacting but also more forgiving than the vague pressure of the world. Leadership and role modeling are social vectors that either loosen or tighten our capacity to act. When someone we respect shows how imperfect beginnings look, when they publish drafts, show early sketches, talk about mistakes, they lower the perceived cost of trying. Leaders set tone not only through policy but through visible practice. If the person with power only displays finished monuments, Those downstream will mistake perfection for normalcy and stall. If leaders reveal their process, the false starts, the small rituals, the micro-commitments, they tacitly grant permission to be human. This is the ethical dimension of influence, choosing whether to create a culture of fear or a culture of repair. Accountability, when done well, is compassion with teeth. The difference between shaming and accountability is what the other person brings to the table. Curiosity and consequence versus humiliation. The golden rule for accountability is to design it so that it helps the person sustain small actions, not punish them for inevitable lapses. Invite an accountability partner who will ask, "What did you try?" rather than "Why did you fail?" Make the check-ins brief, specific, and kind. Make the commitments themselves small and immediate. Don't promise a novel in a week. Promise a page and make that promise public to one trustworthy witness. The social contract is strongest when it is precise. A specific action at a specified time with a known check-in. We must talk about shame because it is a social poison that disguises itself as motivation. Shame says you are broken, fix yourself. Guilt says you did something, repair it. The social architectures that weaponize shame, teams that mock, communities that humiliate, do not produce sustained action. They produce hiding. If your environment weaponizes shame, either change the environment or build strict boundaries around it. Cultivate relationships that practice restorative feedback. Speak about behaviors and outcomes, not about intrinsic worth. Teach your communities a repair protocol. When someone misses, ask what happened, invite a small experiment, and plan a specific next move. Make failure a pivot point for learning, not a sentence. There is tactical beauty in micropublics. Tiny groups created for the express purpose of making the ordinary extraordinary. A writing duo that meets twice a week for 30 minutes. A running buddy who shows up without fail on Thursdays. A small Slack channel where members post the day's smallest win. These are social technologies. They convert private intentions into shared rituals and make accountability feel like companionship rather than surveillance. Start small. Invite one other person into a measured pact. The parameters must be kind, concrete, and cancelable only with notice. Watch how the simple assurance of someone else's presence changes the arithmetic of beginning. But social tools can be misused. Public metrics and follower counts can turn endeavor into performance, and performance can create procrastination through perfectionism. We wait until the image is flawless before we dare show it. Use publicness to create gentle nudges, not to manufacture a stage. Consider the question: do you want to be admired, or do you want to learn? If the answer is the latter, choose arenas where process is visible and where feedback is grounded in craft. There is also a radical possibility in reciprocity. When you help others begin, you make beginning easier for yourself. Teaching, mentoring, and co-working do double duty. They make you accountable and they create structures that require you to act. This is not cynical manipulation. It is cooperative design. When you commit to another person's progress, you are more likely to honor your own small steps. The social contract becomes mutual scaffolding. Finally, remember that relationships are both resources and responsibilities. You cannot offload your entire interior life onto others. Social scaffolds must be paired with internal work. But you also do not need to invent courage alone. Choose the neighborhoods you inhabit, curate the rituals you adopt, build micropublics that prize repair over spectacle, and anchor your tiny acts in social practices that reward continuity more than instant brilliance. Ask yourself, who in my life makes starting feel possible? Who makes it feel dangerous? What small, public promise could I make that invites support rather than judgment? Tomorrow, try this experiment. Find one person who will commit to a 30-minute co-work session with you and one 5-minute check-in afterward. Keep the promise in small print. We will each report one concrete action we attempted. No more, no less. See how the shared presence changes the tone of beginning. The social world can be either sieve or scaffold. Learn to choose which parts you step into. Learn also to become a scaffold for others. The cost of isolation is heavy. The cost of careless publicness is heavy. Between those poles lies a practicable way. Small, kind, enforceable social structures that make movement not merely desirable but normal. When you fold publicness into tenderness, You convert the glare of the world into a lamp that helps you see the first step clearly. When you are ready, we will move on from the communal frame to the inner ethics of commitment, how to make promises to yourself that you will actually keep, how to repair them when you don't, and how to make a durable friendship with the future person you intend to become. Promises are small contracts you make with a person who lives in two time zones, the present you and the future you. Often those contracts are negotiated hastily. An oath uttered in the glow of intention, written in the ink of hope, and then left in a drawer where distracted mornings and soft excuses can open them and smudge the signature. The inner ethics of commitment is the artistry of writing contracts that are not only sincere but survivable. Agreements that honor your values without requiring superhuman will, that build trust across time rather than bankrupt it with broken vows. Trust is the currency here. Every kept promise makes a small deposit into an account labeled, "I can rely on myself." Every broken promise withdraws, sometimes with compound interest. After a while, the ledger reads that you are hardly a bank at all. This is not moralizing. It is bookkeeping. Identity is built on continuity. If the person who sets plans is repeatedly not the one who shows up, the mind learns a new script. Intention is spectacle, not governance. To change that script, you must design promises that your present and your future selves can plausibly both accept. Why do so many promises to ourselves fail? Because they are asking the wrong things of the wrong moment. We promise as if future you will be the same as present you, with identical energy, mood, context, and appetite. But time fragments us. There are moments of strength and moments of thinness. Promises fail when they are brittle, when they depend upon ideal conditions, extraordinary energy, or the absence of emotion. They fail also when they are vague. "I'll get fit" is easy to defer. "I'll walk 20 minutes at 7:30 tomorrow" is a tangible appointment. Finally, promises break when they ask too much identity change in one jump. The human mind resists lurching identity. It prefers to test the water with a toe rather than cannonball into a new self. So how do you make promises you are likely to keep? Start small and be specific. Treat the promise as a frame. What exactly will be done, when, and where? Instead of "I'll write," say, "I will write for 10 minutes at my desk after my morning coffee." Add the condition, "after," the duration, 10 minutes, and the cue, "after my coffee." These make abstract intent into a logistical fact. Reduce the ask to something your future self will find plausible even on a thin day. This is not cheating. It is wise contract design. Make rewards immediate and visible. The future benefits of a promise, health, mastery, reputation, are real but distant. The brain needs nearer confirmation to keep trying. Pair the effort with something that lands now. A ritual cup of tea after a session, a check on a calendar that turns red to green, a small note of self-congratulation. Another powerful move is to introduce a reciprocal commitment. Attach the promise to a social witness. Tell one person and ask them to check in. Social visibility converts private friction into communal support. Choose witnesses who will be kind and exacting, not cruel. Use commitment devices thoughtfully. There is the classically dramatic kind, locking your money into a penalty, or the gentler kinds, scheduled appointments, automatic transfers, or public declarations. Commitment devices work because they change the payoff structure, but design them ethically. Do not create punishments that break your dignity or autonomy. The goal is to help your future self, not to shame them. Think of identity as the slow background music that makes certain steps feel natural. When you name the promise in identity terms, you turn the act into a rehearsal of character. "I am someone who practices daily" carries more weight than "I will practice today." But do not confuse slogan with sculpture. Identity claims must be supported by repeated small acts. Make the promise the smallest possible act that, if repeated, would make the claim true. Let the identity be earned, not proclaimed. Promises will sometimes break. This is inevitable. The inner ethics here is less about never failing than about how you repair. Repair is the moral technology of sustaining trust. A repair ritual should be immediate, specific, and proportionate. When you notice a broken promise, do not begin with recrimination. Name the fact plainly. "I promised X and I didn't do it." Take responsibility without moral annihilation. This is accountability, not self-flagellation. Analyze why. Was the ask too big? Was the cue missing? Did the environment conspire? Did you prioritize something else without noticing? Learn one concrete lesson and implement one concrete change. Then set a new, small step that is possible now, a micro-contract that can be enacted within minutes. Call your witness, write a 30-word plan in your notebook, do 5 minutes of the task immediately. These moves transform failure from a verdict into data. Add a modest restitution if you need moral weight. Not as punishment, but as a tangible acknowledgement that promises matter. It might be a small donation to a cause you respect, an extra 5 minutes of work toward the promise, or a public note of apology to a person affected. Restitution heals the relational ripples that a broken promise creates, both toward others and toward your own sense of integrity. Keep the restitution proportional and, crucially, reparative rather than punitive. The point is repair, not self-immolation. There is an important ethic in the way you speak to yourself through the repair process. Shame is corrosive. It erodes the very capacity to change. Guilt, specifically action-oriented guilt, can be useful because it leads to reparation. Make your inner language align with repair. Say, I slipped. What is the smallest way to make amends? Rather than, I'm hopeless. Choose curiosity over condemnation. That posture opens possibilities rather than burrowing trenches. Make friends with your future self. Imagine a daily ecology where morning you and evening you have different responsibilities. Let morning you be the planner and seller of visions, but make a pact where morning you's promises are constrained by the mitigating terms evening you needs. One practical tool is the future self letter. Write from your future self to your present self, describing what lived in success feels like, the small habits that made it possible, and gentle advice. Another is the pre-authority move. Let present you designate certain powers to the future self. A veto on major commitments, the ability to postpone non-essential tasks, or the right to a rest day. Conversely, let your future self assign conditions for forgiveness. These moves humanize both poles of time and create intertemporal empathy. Cultivate rituals that treat promises as ceremonies. Signing a small written pledge, placing it on a visible shelf, sealing it with a simple ritual. These acts give gravity to the contract and create physical cues that remind you of the pledge. Rituals do not make the promise easier by magic. They make it more legible. They create a bridge between abstract value and concrete act. Philosophically, promises to oneself are acts of character formation. They are not merely pragmatic. They are moral projects. When you reliably make and keep small agreements, you are not just finishing tasks. You are cultivating trustworthiness, a quality that extends into relationships and to the social world. There is a dignity in being the kind of person who honors their word, even in the private chamber of their own life. But dignity must be tenderly earned. It is destroyed by perfectionism that forbids failure. The ethical middle path asks for honesty, modesty, and repair. Ask yourself now, what promise could you make tonight that your future self would thank you for? Make it small, time-stamped, and witnessable. If you imagine breaking it, what concrete restitution will feel meaningful and fair? How will you repair the trust if you stumble? Picture the ledger as not a verdict but as a map. Where would you like your deposits to go, and what small, repeatable acts will fill them? Try this immediate experiment. Write one line that names a tiny promise, date it for tomorrow, and put it somewhere you will see it first thing. Tell one person the promise in a single sentence and ask them to ask you about it tomorrow. If you fail, follow the repair script. Acknowledge, learn one lesson, take one tiny corrective action now, and document it. Do this for a week and watch how small, manageable deposits change the tenor of your inner bank. The ethics of commitment is an intimate craft. It is about being honest without cruelty, ambitious without cruelty to the self, and patient without passivity. It asks that you become both a friend and a steward to the person who will carry the life you are building. Keep your promises small enough to be kept, public enough to be honored, and generous enough to allow for repair. Over time, these small contracts stitch together into a life whose seams you can trust. When you are ready, we will move into the penultimate part: how to cultivate curiosity, wonder, and meaningful motivation so that promises are not just dutiful acts but invitations to a life that feels alive. There is a quiet, often neglected muscle that sits behind every sustained life of work and care: curiosity. It is less glamorous than talent and less sermonized than discipline, and yet it is the single soft force that can turn grim duty into sustained exploration and brittle promises into invitations. Curiosity is the warm current that makes beginnings sweet instead of sharp. It is not simply an appetite for facts. It is an orientation, a stance toward uncertainty that says, I will go near what I do not yet understand. When you cultivate curiosity, you do something radical. You turn the friction of fear into the friction of investigation. The same trembling that might have pulled you backward can, with a slight re-aiming, pull you forward. Think of curiosity as a psychological lever. When you change the question you ask about a task, when you move from "will I succeed?" to "what small thing can I learn if I try?" you change the entire emotional currency of the moment. The former question stakes your identity on the outcome. The latter treats the moment as an experiment. Experiments do not demand perfection. They demand attention. They ask for engaged observation, not certitude. This is vital because one of the central reasons action feels harder than intention is that we hypertrophy the stakes in our imaginations. We imagine verdicts. Curiosity lowers the stakes by converting verdicts into data. Cultivating curiosity is not mystical. It is practical. Start by noticing in a way that is gentle and precise. When you face a task that feels heavy, writing, speaking, cleaning, notice the first three sensations. What time of day is it? What is your posture? What is the first thought that arrives? Name these observations quietly to yourself. This is 8:12. My shoulders are tight. I'm thinking, I should do it perfectly. Naming is surprisingly disarming. It pauses the rush of judgment and creates a small observational distance. In that space, curiosity flourishes. You can then ask, what small question would make this task interesting right now? What tiny experiment could I run that would produce information rather than certainty? Wonder is the cousin of curiosity, but with a different tone. Curiosity asks, wonder absorbs. Wonder is not always appropriate to every practical task, but cultivated well, it becomes the seasoning that makes the ordinary less banal. Wonder can be as small as marveling at the mechanics of a pen, the way light falls across a page, the subtle rhythm of your breath as focus arrives. You do not have to moralize these moments. You can simply attend. The act of attending itself is a kind of repair for the fractured attention modern life demands. When you approach tasks with small pockets of wonder, you change the effective background from a confrontation to a communion. There is a deep philosophical reframing here. Motivation is often treated as something you either have or do not have, an internal temperature. But what if motivation were a landscape you could map and tend? Curiosity becomes a compass on that map. It points toward particularities, toward edges and seams. If you are stuck, ask a local question, not a global verdict. Not, can I be productive? But, what would be the smallest form of this task that would give me one new piece of information? Small, local questions convert amorphous dread into manageable inquiries. They give your present self something doable that does not annihilate the future self with expectation. There are psychological techniques that strengthen curiosity. One is to practice the 5 whys in a Kinder register. Not an interrogation, but a gentle excavation. When you resist a task, ask, why am I avoiding this? And then ask why again to the answer, not to shame, but to illuminate. Often the first answer will be a surface emotion, boredom, fear, tiredness, and by the third or fourth why you find a practical pivot. A missing cue, an unreasonable time expectation, an unspoken identity threat. Another technique is to reframe failure as informative feedback. If an experiment fails, write one line about what it taught you. You are building a small dossier of evidence. The world is not a jury but a lab. Philosophy can deepen the work. Think of your life as a set of invitations rather than a ledger of obligations. There will be times when obligations must be honored, children to feed, deadlines to meet, but even obligations can be attended to with curiosity. Ask yourself what the obligation teaches about your values. What do the tasks you dread reveal about the person you imagine yourself to be? What recurring resistances point to a misalignment between role and soul? Use curiosity to translate that data into actionable choices. Change the framing of the task, change the schedule, or change the task itself. Sometimes the wisest move is not to grit your teeth, but to renegotiate the terms of engagement. Meaning is the amplifier of curiosity. A task that feels meaningless resists motion. A task that is given even a small thread of significance is easier to enter. But meaning is not something you always discover. Sometimes you make it. Ask yourself what you are trying to sustain in taking this action. Is it trust with someone, mastery, a question you care about, the memory of a person who mattered? Anchor actions to those threads. If meaning still feels thin, create a ritual or a symbolic act that gives the work a seam into the sacred. Light a candle before you write. Tie a ribbon before you practice. Make a small index card that reminds you of the why. Rituals do not create meaning by themselves, but they make meaning legible and repeatable. Part of cultivating wonder is to design curiosity into your environment. Novelty is a raw material for attention. It does not mean constant change. It means strategic variation. If you always begin your work in the same place, sometimes move the chair, put a new object on the desk, play an unfamiliar piece of music, change the cup you drink from, the smallest novelty can recalibrate your attention. Novelty's power comes from interrupting autopilot long enough for curiosity to notice. This is how you renew the scene without needing to reinvent the task. There is also an ethical dimension. Curiosity can be compassionate. When you are curious about your own procrastination rather than contemptuous, you reduce shame and open possibilities. Curiosity invites you to ask, what wound or need lies beneath this avoidance? Rather than, what is wrong with me? To do this is not to rationalize inertia. It is to detect patterns that are invisible beneath self-reproach. The answers you find may be tender, grief, exhaustion, unresolved conflict, and the response required will often be care, not punishment. Curiosity transforms self-care from indulgence into intelligence. Another instrument is the micro-experiment. Treat motivation as hypotheses to be tested. Choose one tiny variable, start time, presence of music, length of session, posture, and run it for a week. Observe without judging. Which configuration made starting easier? Which made momentum more likely? This method turns willpower into a research program. It also produces the kind of small wins that feed both curiosity and trust. You are not trying to metamorphose overnight. You are collecting data in the service of better design. Cultivating wonder also means cultivating patience with the slow, almost invisible returns of deep work. If curiosity is a compass, patience is the map reader who refuses to be panicked by delayed progress. Some sorts of learning and skill deepen over seasons and years. The modern appetite for instant feedback can sabotage curiosity by demanding measurable results too quickly. To resist this, create feedback loops that are immediate and small. Daily logs, 5-minute reflections, visible marks on a calendar, so that the long arc of your project is made legible in incremental ways. Celebrate the curiosity itself as a form of success. You asked a new question today, you tried a tiny variant, you noticed 3 new things. The practice itself is the prize. What about boredom, the old enemy of curiosity? Boredom is often the mind's signal that the environment is too predictable or insufficiently stimulating. It is not a moral failing but a prompt. Respond with a tiny spice. A new constraint, a timer, a deadline, an unusual pairing, rewrite the task as a game. Constraints paradoxically activate creativity. If you cannot remove the duty, make the duty into a puzzle. Ask, how many solutions in 20 minutes can I sketch? What absurd constraint might force a novel angle? Games make the brain willing to try. Finally, curiosity is a communal practice. You do not have to be alone in wonder. Cultivate conversations with people who ask different questions than you do. Read authors who are not in your field. Spend time with people who are older for the sake of perspective and with people who are younger for the sake of surprise. Ask simple, open questions of others. What is the strangest thing you noticed this week? What question has been following you lately? These habits widen your question field and remind you that curiosity is contagious. Right now, before you move on, try this tiny exercise. Pick one task that has been heavy for you and write a single, small question about it. Something curious, not judgmental. Make that question specific and kind. Not, why am I lazy? But, what is the smallest piece of this task that would give me new information? Promise yourself 1 minute to pursue the answer. Report back to no one but your own notebook. Curiosity needs practice as much as any muscle. 1 minute is enough to begin. In the end, the most durable motivation is not a constant flame but a local weather pattern you learn to navigate. Curiosity like a breeze, wonder like a clear morning, meaning like a sun that returns. When you treat the inner life as a garden of questions rather than a courtroom of verdicts, action becomes less the answer to a moral test and more the consequence of being attentively alive. Cultivate questions that are generous, experiments that are kind, and rituals that make meaning visible. Promise less to your future at times of high heat, and promise more to it in the cool heads of ritual and curiosity. Let your promises be invitations, not indictments. When you are ready, we will close the arc in part 8, pulling all these threads into a practical, compassionate conclusion that helps you step into action with less fear and more fidelity to the person you want to become. Stand at the edge of what you have learned so far and breathe. This is the place where theory becomes practice, where maps fold into footsteps. You came here because intention felt like a bright promise and action felt, too often, like a closed door. Over the last 7 parts, we pulled back the curtain. We met the voices that speak in your head. We examined the canyon between deciding and doing. We learned the subtle architecture of habits. We tended the ledger of energy and will. We invited the social world to be your scaffold rather than your judge. We forged survivable promises to the future person you will be, and we cultivated curiosity as a daily compass. Now, in this last movement, let us take all of those lessons and weave them into a single coherent way to live. One that honors fatigue and fear, that sharpens practical habit, and that still leaves room for wonder. Begin by refusing the old binary, either heroic willpower or helpless complaint. Human life does not run on binary electricity. It runs on a fragile grid of tiny circuits that, if wired thoughtfully, can power large houses. Treat your commitments like electrical work. You do not try to wire the whole house in a single night. You wire one outlet, test it, label it, secure it. The moral of the wiring metaphor is this: the durable life is built from safe, tested, modular pieces that connect to one another. Your 2-minute starts, your named voices, your ritualized openings, your social packs, these are outlets. Plug them into one another. When you repeat them, they form a house. Start tomorrow with 3 promises that are small enough that your future self will not revolt. Promise 1. A 2-minute initiation to the task that matters most. Promise 2. A ritual, something explicit you do before you begin. A quiet signal, a cup, a stretch, a sentence that tells your inner committee it's safe to move. Promise 3. A repair protocol. If you break a promise, you do one small restorative act within the hour. A minute of honest writing about what happened. A call to your witness. A 5-minute corrective action. These 3 acts, initiation, ritual, repair, compress everything we have discussed into a practical triad. They honor your energy, enlist the voices with kindness, and create evidence in the ledger. Make your environment an ally. Put the cue where you can see it and remove the temptations that steal the first motion. Small changes in the room are not trivial. They are agreements you make with the part of you that likes to avoid. The brain does not judge these agreements. It simply notices what is easier. Let ease be your instrument, and when you feel fear, name it. Speak to the critic not with force but with curiosity. What is it protecting me from? Offer the saboteur a genuine, scheduled reprieve as part of the contract so it has less reason to bargain for an entire day of avoidance. These are negotiations, not trickery. Remember the counsel. Keep a short log of the voices you encounter. Give them names. Bargain with them in written sentences. The more concrete your promises to each voice, the less they will sabotage. The critic wants safety. Tell it you will run a small test and report back. The perfectionist wants polish. Promise a distinct revision phase so the first draft is allowed to be messy. The planner can be your clerk, but do not let it chain you to endless prep. Make it supply you with a simple architecture, a cue, a routine, a reward, and ask it to lock the plan to a clock. Scale by iteration, not by courage. Increase your load horizontally and vertically when the pattern is steady. If your 2-minute ritual becomes faithful, let it grow 2 minutes to 5, 5 to 15. Add a new habit that stacks onto an old one. The goal is not to impress. It is to accrete. A life of steady, small gains changes identity because identity is the slow arithmetic of repetition. Invite company. Choose one person, one trustworthy, kind companion, and create a micropublic for doing the thing that matters. A 30-minute co-work session twice a week is worth more than an enormous weekend of solitary heroism. Let accountability be a small, explicit, kind mechanism. One sentence, one check-in, one tiny report. When you make a private intention public to someone who holds you with curiosity rather than condemnation, you reframe the risk of trying into a shared experiment. Cultivate curiosity as method, not mood. When dread arrives, ask one question that is local and useful: what can I learn in 5 minutes? And then do a micro-experiment. Keep the question so small that the answer cannot be impossible. Track what you learn for a week. Curiosity converts terror into data, and data dissolves myth. The practice of asking small questions trains your attention to be generous rather than punitive. Tend your ledger by tending your body. Rest is not a detour from productivity. It is its foundation. Know your rhythms and plan your hardest happenings when your energy is real. Limit choices in the margins of your day so your willpower is available when the day asks of it. Make your rituals predictable. Sleep, simple meals, movement. The more you institutionalize basic energy, the less you need heroic will to cross small thresholds. Promise to yourself in ways that are survivable. When making a promise, include a contingency clause. If X happens, then I will do Y instead. These clauses are not loopholes. They are compassion. They make contracts come true by staying honest about the reality of tomorrow. And when you break a promise, repair immediately. The ritual of repair, acknowledge, learn one small corrective step, converts failure into an opportunity to build reliability rather than into a reason to give up. Hold culture and comparison lightly. Curate your feeds and companions so that the models you use are proximate enough to make steps believable. Seek communities of practice where process is visible and practice is expected. When you see someone publish a messy draft or speak about an early failure, that is permission to begin. Let models be mentors, not magistrates. Finally, practice radical kindness with your inner life. The voice that calls you lazy or insufficient is often a ragged, frightened guard. Meet it with curiosity. What story does it fear will be true if you act? Offer it small evidence by starting tiny. Celebrate the motion. Keep a visible tally, a calendar, a streak, a small green check that accumulates into a quiet shrine of trust. Over time, the ledger thickens with deposits and the critic softens into an editor. Ask yourself, in the particular terms of your life, what is the smallest true beginning you can commit to tomorrow morning? Who will be your witness? What ritual will you use to invite your muse and tame your critic? If you could reframe one identity claim, I am not a morning person, or I am not disciplined, into a practiced, evidence-backed claim, what would it be? What small experiment can you run for 7 days that will produce data rather than drama? There is one last philosophical thing to hold. Freedom and constraint are partners. True freedom is not the absence of structure. It is the presence of chosen constraints that free your attention for what matters. Choose them with care. The paradox is beautiful. You will feel freer when you bind your mornings to a small ritual, when you promise repairs, when you name your voices, and when you enlist a friend. These bindings do not trap you. They authorize you to be the person who keeps promises. I will leave you with an invitation that is both practical and tender. Tonight, pick one task that has been waiting. Name the voice that most often stops you. Write exactly one sentence to that voice, acknowledging its care and asking for one modest concession. Then write one small, time-stamped promise to yourself. 2 minutes, one ritual, one repair. Place the note where you will see it first thing. Tell one person the promise in one sentence. In the morning, do the 2 minutes. No more, no less. When you finish, mark the day, celebrate the motion. The canyon between intention and action is real. It is not a moral verdict, but a terrain to be navigated. You have been carrying heavy lessons and tender tools. Use them lightly and persistently. Make your life a series of experiments, each one kind to the parts of you that have reason to resist. Over time, the small operations will become the architecture of your days, and the person you imagine will be not a distant phantom but the one who shows up again and again with small, steady steps. You have what it takes. Not perfect will, but the capacity to design intelligence into your life. Begin with compassion, begin with a 2-minute motion, and let the rest follow.